I'm Luke, and if you're here, you may be nervous about your first psychedelic experience. So, going right into it, we're going to address the questions. Will I have a bad trip? How to prevent a bad trip? Troubling experiences with weed? Can you get addicted to psychedelics? And a general Q. First things first, will I have a bad trip? So, you're wondering, will I have a bad trip? The first thing to know is in the psychedelic world, we've moved away from the language of bad trip versus good trip. And the first fact that may surprise you that is important to this is the fact that whether or not people experience challenging or unpleasant or uncomfortable experiences during a psychedelic journey, that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't get a positive outcome. Let me rephrase that. People get positive outcomes from psychedelic journeys, even if they're an unpleasant, challenging, uncomfortable experience. And some people might say, you want to probably have a challenging experience if there's something inside you that you really need to confront, and that's probably going to be unpleasant. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a troubling, a challenging experience in order for you to get benefit. You can have pleasant experiences and also get really great benefits from that. So the words that we prefer to use when we talk about bad trips is a challenging experience. Because if you forthrightly face it and you work through it, then you have something to gain, to gain like you would if it were a challenge. Here's a question. There's a bunch of people who've used psychedelics. Out of all of those people, how many of them feel like they've overall had a negative experience of psychedelics? Well, that's a really great question that was answered just this year on a very fresh survey of Canadian psychedelic users. And what they found was out of several thousand people, only 5% of the psychedelic users responded to an overall negative experience or perceptions of psychedelic use after using it, after frequently using psychedelics at different amounts per person, but overall all psychedelic users. So that's interesting because the frequency of negative experiences is higher than that. But even with the people who had the negative experiences, they said that the overall people said they had a positive or didn't express clear or negative positive views. So let's say you ask people who had a very negative, let's say unpleasant, challenging experience on a psychedelic. Well, after that experience, did you feel like you got good out of it? Okay. How many of them felt like they got good out of their experience? And the answer is about 55% of people after having a negative experiences agreed that good came out of the experience, and only 18% disagreed that good came out of the experience. So even if you do have the negative experience in the psychedelic journey, the majority of people gain some benefit. And those benefits were actually listed in the survey, and they said the number one was that they gained insights. The next one is that they overcame some fears. And the third is that it resolved a challenging situation or emotion. So we understand how psychedelics work. They act as a non-specific amplifier. They tend to bring things up that are inside that you may have suppressed, or that you may not be facing, or that you just put aside and not dealt with, or you may be aware is there, but then you want to deal with. And it can sometimes bring that stuff up, that trauma, that bad memory, that experience, fears that you have, and it gives you an opportunity to work through it. Now, ideally, you want to opt into facing your fears, and it's something that you build yourself up to. Instead of having like an overwhelming experience. But even if it's overwhelming in a psychedelic journey and you weren't expecting it for, that could, you could conceive that as being a challenging thing, you can still get benefit out of it. So here's a question. When people have the challenging experience, what is it that they describe as being so challenging about it? Well, in the studies about the specific things that people experienced in their negative psychedelic experiences, the number one thing 61% of people reported was mental or sensory overload. Now, one thing that is known, I believe, from the Roland Griffiths lab that they found, one of the key things that led to people having positive outcomes was actually knowing what is typical to expect from a psychedelic journey. So, for example, ego death or a sense of loss of identity with your body. If you don't expect those things to happen, it can be tremendously uncomfortable and you can feel like you're actually dying, when really, if you know that it's just part of the process and something that's typical to expect, then it doesn't become something that you can react to or freak out about. So, if you understand that it can be a very intense sensory experience, then maybe you'll take precautions when you're using the psychedelics to account for that and to prepare yourself for that. And if you just know that it can get really intense and you know that it's going to end eventually, then maybe it won't be that challenging even during the experience. Second thing people experience is social paranoia. This is easily addressed if you're very cautious about the environments that you're taking psychedelics in. If you have a trusted who you know you can trust, who's with you, who's sober, who's able to tend to your needs, to get you water, help you go to the bathroom, get you food if you need, whatever it may be, then that will reduce social paranoia, of course, because there's no other people around. Now, if you're at a music festival and you've taken a bunch of mushrooms from some stranger, and you start to feel a little bit paranoid about the people around you. There's people in weird costumes. It's very dark. Who knows, where's home? My tent is fell over. Like, then social paranoia is something that you're more likely to experience. Other things that people experience as being the negative aspect of their experience: confronting challenging life issues. That's only a bad thing if you don't want to confront your challenging life issues. Otherwise, that's something that in my past, when I've intentionally use psychedelics, I want to face my challenging life issues. In fact, I'm so frustrated that I know I have these challenges, these problems I want to deal with, but I can't seem to bring them up and process them. And so psychedelics are a tool for doing that proactively. Another thing people thought that felt contributed to their negative experience was also being worried about their health, experiencing troubling or menacing visions, or worried that you would never be the same, and also being worried that you might die. So these are things that can be dealt with. Some of these and diminish. It's like you don't need to worry that you might die. You aren't going to die. Just knowing that, and knowing that the sensation of death is associated with ego death, knowing that can help reduce that kind of fear as it's happening. Worried you'll never be the same. Well, if you're coming in with the intentions for transformation, then that's exactly what you want. Yeah. So now, how to prevent a bad trip, quote unquote, bad trip, challenging trip. Well, there's a few things that you can do, but what I'm going to do is describe a story first of maybe what not to do. So, for example, this is a friend of mine, a very personal story, actually. He was on a trip to a foreign country, a popular vacation destination, and a few things to consider about this. So, this is like a normal, average dude, like business type guy, university educated, has friends, social, family, in good mental, physical health, nothing going on, and he's curious about psychedelics. So he's on this trip to this tropical location, and the first thing to consider was his friends were supposed to come on the trip with him, but they bailed. His friends didn't come with him on the trip, and so he was feeling kind of lonely. He was feeling isolated. He was feeling unhappy being in this tropical location, which is horrible. Like, you're feeling bad inside when you're in this like beautiful vacation place. And I know that he had been going out and trying to have fun, but there's something going on for him, and he didn't seem to like really connect with people, and he's feeling very lonely and isolated from others. And maybe a little bit of betrayal and frustration with his friends there, maybe a little bit of anger too. Next thing to consider, he's in this foreign country. He doesn't know his way around necessarily. He had a hotel room, but that's not like a home space necessarily. And people can come knocking on the door and they clean up the room and stuff, so it's not totally private. And he's walking around the streets of this town. Then the next thing to consider is this: he wanted to have a mushroom journey, and when he was there, he had a few microdosing experiences and had received a chocolate bar, a psilocybin chocolate bar, from the dealer that he was connected with down there. And so every dose that he had received from this dealer was 1 gram, 1 gram, 1 gram, and then this chocolate bar hits 1 gram. So he's going to have the whole chocolate bar, and it'll probably just be like a casual trip, and it'll go from there. But this is where it went wrong. The chocolate bar was not 1 gram. The chocolate bar was 7 grams. And for any of you know about typical dosing with mushrooms, 7 grams is a lot. That is a lot of mushrooms. And that, like, you don't even do that when you're going in intentional therapeutic use. That's a lot. You might do, 3 grams, something like that. That can lead to sensory overload. 7 grams can be traumatic, especially with what I just mentioned before, the two considerations, the set and the setting. So he began this 7 gram mushroom journey in a foreign country, in a hotel room, not in a hotel room, walking around in the streets of this town without his friends, with no one there to take care of him, with just strangers walking around, and has these powerful and intense religious themed visions and experiences while going through all this separation and loneliness from the people around him and being in this foreign place. It ended up leading to negative outcomes for him, which is to say mental health issues going on, 6 months plus from the experience, disconnected from his friends, pausing his entire life in business and education, basically a major interrupt to his life, and not a positive experience at all. So I want to share this because that can happen, and it's something definitely to talk about, and we can learn from it and prevent that from happening for people in the future. So the three considerations are mindset, aka setting, and dosage. For dosage, you want to know your dose. He didn't know his dose. It was 7 grams. He thought it was 1 gram. Very, very important. If someone gives you mushrooms and they don't know what the strain is, some strains can be 5 to 10 times stronger than others. So a handful can be a lot, while a handful of another one might be, a mini dose or something like that. So really, it's totally a gamble if you don't know the strain of the mushroom that you're having if you're having mushrooms. LSD tabs, they can also the dosage can vary quite a bit. MDMA capsules, you can't really tell necessarily from eyeing it. You might need to weigh it out. And you also want to have your test your psychedelics as well, because you don't want other stuff going in there. You don't want any stuff being involved. Some of them are less prone to being having other substances in there. Like actually having a physical mushroom is kind of imagining someone powdering it with something. That's less likely, while capsules may be more likely. So you want to test to be careful, and also know if you're going into the journey and you think you aren't feeling anything, definitely give yourself a solid hour. For almost any medicines out there, you want to give it at least an hour to see if you're feeling nothing. And then the protocol that James Fadiman proposed in the book Psychedelic Explorer's Guide is after the initial dose of whatever amount it was, if after an hour, hour and a half, you aren't feeling anything, take only up to 50% of that initial dose. So let's say you take 1 gram for your journey and you don't feel anything after an hour and a half or after an hour, then take another 0.5 grams as a booster dose. But don't take another 3 grams. Or a friend of mine, his first experience was extremely traumatizing as well. He had 11 grams of mushrooms. And it was partly because he didn't know what he was doing, and the guy who provided the mushrooms was completely irresponsible and also had no idea what he was doing. He had had half of a bag of mushrooms, which I don't know how many grams that is, but it's a lot. I think he said it was like 5 grams. And then when he wasn't feeling anything after an hour, the guy said, "Oh, just have the rest of the bag." And it ended up adding up to around total of 11 grams. And he went to the hospital. Horrible experience, super traumatizing. So 50% booster is what you want to do. And if for whatever reason it was a dud, you weren't feeling anything, it's not going anywhere, then that's okay. You can try again another day. You don't need, if after you've done the 50% booster, nothing's happening, you can try another day, try a different source, try a different strain, try a different mushroom, try a different substance if you want. Up to you. That's something you can do there. Now, the second thing to consider is the set, aka your mindset. So if you want to prevent a bad trip, know that if there's actively troubling things going on for you, then maybe you don't need a psychedelic to work through and process your emotions. For example, you just broke up with someone, a close one died, you just got fired from work and you're really upset about it. You just got out of a significant brewing long-term conflict. You just got canceled on Twitter. Any of these things, if you feel like it's really hot on your mind and heavy on your mind, and you're actively feeling it, and it's something that's bothering you, why do you need a psychedelic to process it? You're already processing it. Maybe give yourself some time. It's better to err on the side of coming in with a clear mind, relaxed, something isn't actively bothering you, so that when you go into your journey, what will come up are things that are deeper inside that is better what psychedelics do. It's like bringing stuff up that's kind of hard to come up normally. It might not be on the surface. Now, maybe it would help you process that breakup. Maybe it would help you reflect on losing that job. I don't know. That's up to you. But you probably don't need a large journey to do that, right? And again, with the mindset, knowing what typically to expect from a psychedelic journey is a super key factor in you're coming in with the right kind of mindset of being calm and relaxed, so that you know that if stuff does come up, that you can handle it. Last, we got setting. This is the third thing to consider when how to prevent bad or reducing the unnecessary discomfort that can come from challenging psychedelic experiences. So, you want to have a good setting. You don't want to be like my friend who is in that tropical place, walking around the streets of a foreign and potentially dangerous city, and only having like a hotel room where you're alone. You want to be somewhere where you feel safe, you're with someone you trust, and ideally that's sober. Now, that's not always possible, and that can be okay. If people are in a journey and some particular person needs help, friends of mine I've had journeys with friends, and we're all in participating in the ceremony, and actively participating in the ceremony. And if someone needs special attention, you can kind of just manage your own energy and show up for some person. But for people who aren't experienced, say like people in like the coaching world or people who know how to sort of handle themselves well, they might find it hard to support you if you're having a challenging experience. So I know that's possible. Generally, you want to have a sitter, a guide, someone there who's sober to help you get water, get food, or just to be there when you're like, oh my God, this is kind of crazy intense. I think I might be going crazy. They can say, you're not going crazy. It's going to be okay. It's going to end eventually. Just ride it out, even lean into it, because that's how you get the benefit from it. So dosage, set, and setting, how to prevent a bad trip. Now, if you're like me, you've had a trouble experience with weed, and you've maybe had that experience and thought, well, psychedelics, that's like even more intense than cannabis. I don't know if I want to do psychedelics. Um, and I totally know where you're at. That happened to me. I had an edible one time. The first time I had an edible ever, first time I had weed ever, horrible experience. Just like constant anxiety, basically near the edge of like a panic attack for like 4 or 5 hours or something like that. It was terrible. It was horrible. I was like pale in the face and confused. And it felt like I was waking up from a nightmare like every like 10 seconds. Just terrible. So when I wanted to do a mushroom journey, because I heard all the benefits that they had, and maybe you've heard about the benefits that mushroom journeys can have, or any psychedelic journey can be so powerful. It can be like 5 years of therapy in one day. Now, if you want that and you want to have that experience and potentially get that benefit, you might be worried, well, is it going to be like my cannabis experience? I, was feeling like I was losing control. Well, here's something that you can do. If you've had that troubling experience on cannabis, what you can do is have a positive experience on cannabis. That's not so easy though. So you can get it, you can manage the dosing, start small, go slow with the cannabis, build your way up to it. And one thing I noticed between bad experiences on cannabis that relate to bad experiences on psychedelics is the attempt to try to control the experience in your mind. The reason why I got so much anxiety and panic from that weed edible was because I was trying to control my mind. I was trying to stay present. I was trying to be here. Oh my God. What I need to do was just relax, go with the flow, surrender. It's no big deal. Chill out and let myself and my mind just kind of fade into sort of like a dreamy haze, which is how I would describe my experience of cannabis. And when you do that same thing on psychedelics, one thing I notice is my cognitive function is completely normal on psychedelics. Cannabis, there's some like neocortex shutting down thing happening, kind of get dumb. With psychedelics, I can be very sharp. I know exactly what's happening. I can talk to myself in my mind as if I'm right here, like I'm normal. It's just my experience past my consciousness is very different than what it normally is. So practicing relaxing into surrender, that practice of going with the flow, if you can bring that same mindset to your psychedelic experience, then that can be very valuable. So if you've had that bad experience with weed, I'd recommend potentially having a positive experience with it, practicing surrender, go low, go slow with the dosing of the cannabis, of course. Hopefully you just eat a little edible, say 2 milligrams of THC at a time, just build it up until maybe, I do like 7 milligrams as my dose, like very low for many cannabis users, but I find that's all it takes for me to just feel enough and feel loosey and goosey. Um, and yeah, so you want to practice that letting go with the cannabis. That can help a lot with psychedelics. So, okay. And a key point about the surrender is ultimately Unpleasant experiences and challenging experiences on psychedelics comes because you're resisting the experience of whatever's coming up. If you don't resist what's coming up, it tends to pass through you much quickly. It tends to be less uncomfortable. And you may actually realize that in life, 99% of your unpleasant experience of anything is your thinking about it and your inner reaction to it. And if your inner reaction is to say, I don't want this, I want to be sober, this is unpleasant, then it might just get even worse. Now, if you say, okay, this is unpleasant, but this is actually probably the healing happening right now. I can be grateful that I'm feeling this because normally I don't get the opportunity to process these heavy emotions or intense experiences coming up. So if you can flip it and invite that and lean into it, go towards the darkness. I heard someone had been given that advice in a 5-MeO journey, and that served them well. If you can go into the pain, if you can lean into the grief, you can lean into the fear, if you can lean into whatever is coming up, then you can get through it and come out the other side with insight, a new person, transformed. Okay, next question. Can you get addicted to psychedelics? Really good question. Psychedelics are a category of substance. Psychedelics itself means mind manifesting. Technically, your mind's always there. So when you're doing anything, your mind is manifesting in some way. Now, psychedelics are unique because they bring you really deep into really deep confrontation with the core of who you are, deep into your mind. Did I say deep? um, and it can get much more intense. So anyway, psychedelics are actually used to treat addiction is the first thing to consider. So it kind of seems weird that you could be addicted to something that's actually used to treat addiction, but the answer is yes, you can get addicted to certain psychedelics because many substances have that function of bringing up stuff from your subconscious, from your unconscious for you to process and work through, and that can be highly, highly therapeutic. Now, some psychedelics do that, but they also have other properties that give good feelings and make you feel good, and therefore can be addictive. Now, something like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, they are not addictive substances because they don't give you a high. If anything, they give you a low when you're going through a challenging experience. Um, Now, with psychedelics such as ketamine and MDMA, what does the MA stand for in MDMA? If you want to be, I'll just have you Google that. Google what the MA stands for in MDMA. I'm not going to say it so YouTube doesn't censor this video. It's in a category of substances called amphetamines, and they make you feel good. Now, what it also does is it relaxes the amygdala in your brain so that you can go into trauma in ways that you can't normally because there's too much triggering, intense stuff happening. MAPS has done a lot of research into MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, especially with veterans and others, but also tons of other work that MDMA can work with. Ketamine itself is a tranquilizer. It's a horse tranquilizer, ha ha ha, right? In high doses, ketamine and MDMA can induce psychedelic visions and states, just like any other psychedelic. So they are psychedelics. They also have the properties of being addictive. They also have a positive front end experience that comes from it. So it has the potential to be addicting. Now, next thing to consider is the cause of addiction. While certain things can be addictive because they give you something to escape your current problems and reality, addiction is reduced for people who are in community. Addiction is reduced for people who have a sense of meaning and responsibility in the world. It's reduced by people who have friends and family to support them. Isolation is a big factor in addiction. So we know that it isn't just about the substance that makes something addictive. We know that the pattern of addiction is psychologically is associated with addictive patterns, say with gambling, with social media, with unhealthy foods that kind of give you that hit, with sex as well, and anything that sort of gives you that positive experience on the front end, but sort of a long tail over time of reducing the quality of your life. That's the pattern of addiction, or of addictive things. And if you're escaping problems, if you're not facing your problems, then that can lead you to run away from your problems and go to things like MDMA, ketamine, social media, sex, pornography, whatever it may be that you use to get away from your problems. Now, the irony is that psychedelics help you face your problems. So you wouldn't do DMT or psilocybin or LSD to get away from your problems, but anything can be used in an unhealthy habit. So someone can use, and especially microdosing, because it doesn't necessarily cause significant unpleasant experiences, could potentially be part of unhealthy patterns that may be appropriate to call addiction, but maybe not. Or that's not the right phrasing that I want to use there. Yeah, like it's potential that even things like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, which don't have addictive properties like ketamine or MDMA, those ones can still be part of an unhealthy pattern of use. Cool. So now things like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, which don't give you that sort of positive hit on the front end, they can still be part of unhealthy patterns of escape, but maybe not for long, because the effect of what they do is they're non-specific amplifiers. They amplify what's going on for you inside, whatever it may be. It brings stuff up. Whatever that escapism is, it's likely to come up at some point during your journeys. So you may inadvertently treat your addiction, or maybe not, because you probably would resist the experience and not want to go into it and say, "Oh, I was addicted to LSD until I had a bad trip." That's potentially a thing. But here's something that's interesting: patterns of use with psychedelics. What they found is people who use psychedelics overall, they're 40, let me say specifically in that survey of Canadian psychedelic users, 43.7% of people cite a decreasing or ceasing of alcohol use as a result of psychedelic use. Another one was around 43% of people also cite a decreasing or ceasing entirely of cocaine use. So what we see is that people who use psychedelics tend to use other substances that are more harmful less, which is great. Now that's very good to note. Now, some people do note increased use of certain substances, but the majority of people cite a decreased use of other substances. So other things to consider is, there's some stats about MDMA and ketamine as being used more frequently than other substances. So, or being used, substances that has certain users who use it very frequently. So that would be the users who may be an addictive pattern around ketamine or MDMA. So the specific numbers is the average number of times that all the 2,000 or so people, 1,600 people who answered this specific question use ketamine is 4. So 4 is the average amount of time. The average is the most populous number of times that people use it is 4. So how many people used it one time, how many used 3, how many used 4, how many used 5, how many used 6? Number 4 was the one that had the most people in that category. But the average was 41.8 times. Now, that can happen where you have a few people who are using it very frequently. So if you have 2 people who have used it 2,000 times, even if most people used it 4 times, it'll move the average up higher. So because the average is much higher than the most frequent number of times it's used, that's an indication that there could be the potential for abuse. And we see that with MDMA as well, where the average amount of the most populous number of times it's been used is 10, but the average amount of times that it's used is 28.8. So there's a few number of users of MDMA who are using it much more frequently than the rest of the people and skewing the average upwards. Now, we also saw that with psilocybin in the study, but that's because they also counted microdosing. They didn't distinguish between microdosing and macrodosing. So people who macrodose on average 2 months or less for the majority of people, which is actually even longer for most people because frequent users skewed even that statistic. Psilocybin microdosing is done every day, right? You wouldn't have a full dose session every single day. So including the microdosers in this skewed that number quite a bit for psilocybin. But anyway, so that is all the stuff we have there. Now I'm open to questions if anyone has any. And if you're over on my Instagram, I'm over on YouTube answering some questions. So I'm going to start with the first question that I've pre-prepared for you guys, which is, have I had a bad trip before? Let me tell you this. I've had some challenging experiences. 2 days ago, I had my 3rd ever ayahuasca ceremony, and there were some very challenging moments in it. Intense physical discomfort. If you know about ayahuasca, it can involve purging, which is woo or woo. And there's a lot of almost happening for me, but my stomach was super queasy and upset, and it was like trying to come out, but it wouldn't go. And so I spent maybe an hour just like in discomfort, like lying on the ground with a bucket next to me, sort of like burping and like trying to just like relieve it if I can. Um, and in the experience, I thought, fuck, like I don't know if I ever want to do this again. um, but while it was challenging, I worked through it. I got through it. I ended up purging, and I felt so much better after I purged. And the day after, I felt amazing. I really felt like I had cleared some things. I learned some things about myself. I had some convictions affirmed about the spiritual path that I'm on, and overall, it was an amazing experience. I feel so grounded, so much more capable of presence. I shifted my thinking around like weird sort of work habit mindset that I had, and I'm feeling just light and like I actually can enjoy life now. I got some weird mode before this journey. I don't know what was going on. For like several months, I was stuck, and that kind of kicked me out of it. So another thing, have I had a bad experience? I had a San Pedro mescaline journey with a friend of mine. Just him and I together at his place. Intentional use. We had an opening ceremony. We talked about our intentions. We planned on going for a walk, but we decided to stay in his apartment because the way that we had consumed the mescaline was extremely uncomfortable for the stomach. I was so queasy, almost on the verge of puking. But unlike ayahuasca, it's not part of the experience to puke. It was just that it was just part of the rite of passage for San Pedro is the discomfort of actually and the disgust of drinking the goopy Ghostbuster slime snot textured drink that is um, the powdered cactus. Anyway, so when I was in that journey, I worked through the nausea and everything. On the tail end, for some reason, I entered fear state. This wasn't anxiety. I wasn't like on edge or tense. It was just the environment became sort of hostile. There was this Buddha. He had a Buddha statue in his place that looked like the devil. I don't know how to explain it, but there's the sash, the way a sash went over his shoulder and sort of flowed down, it looked like a devil tail. I don't know how my mind made that. And in the experience, here's my mistake that I made during this journey was to say, okay, I'm ready for this to end, which is what I was thinking. And I hope the audio is working. Is it working? Check, 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 check. Okay, I hope it's working. Anyway, so fear state. I was in fear. The Buddha looked like a devil, which is crazy. And my buddy looked, he didn't look sinister, but I just noticed how dark the corners of the room looked. And, I was at some point, I was leaning into it. I'm like, okay, let me go into this fear and see what's there for me. But it kept on going and going and going, and it didn't change. It felt like I was just stuck in fear. And so at some point I said, you know what, I'm done. I'm done with this. I'm ready to stop. This was maybe like 10, 11 hours into this journey. Crazy long journey, mescaline. It's kind of like LSD, very long. So we ended up putting some like pleasant sunset music video compilation on his TV. And even then, the sunset, I'm like looking in the dark corners. My mind is totally primed for fear, and I'm looking for weird stuff. Um, and slowly it just faded as the journey ended. So what I could have done better was to lean into that more and go into it. But yeah, that was uncomfortable. If I resisted it and said, "Oh God, I don't want to be scared. Oh, is this a bad trip? Oh no, I'm spiraling." It could have been a bad trip. Could have been very challenging. But I worked through it, and I think there would have been more for me there actually if I'd gone even further into it, and I could have worked through it. But it was on the tail end of a journey, and maybe a subsequent journey will bring up that same sensation in the future.